Hey everyone, Nico Shine. I'm over in adversary detection at SpectreOps, working on our primarily blue team and purple team research. Graduated from Naval Academy, did my 5 years in the Navy as an information professional officer, primarily worked in cryptography, satellites. I got out 2 years ago and started working at SpectreOps, and just recently finished my master's at UVA in management of IT. We did this research towards the beginning of the year, and we've been working on it and altering it since as changes have come out. We're really excited to get through it all with you.
All right, so this talk is going to focus on domain persistence techniques. We'll talk about what that is here in a little bit. Ideally, what we're talking about here is where adversaries are able to gain elevated persistence in your environment, basically completely compromising the environment. If anyone remembers the old keep calm and burn down the forest type of scenarios, okay? So what happened? We at SpectreOps did a compromise assessment for a company that said, we think we might be a little bit compromised. And so we decided to take a look in that environment, and it turns out they were really, really, really compromised. And they were like burn down the forest and start all over compromised. So it took a lot of research into kind of identifying the telemetry that a lot of these attacks generate, because at the time, the client was not detecting any of those domain persistence techniques. And additionally, we had to do a whole bunch of like recovery-based research, because at the time, there was only really like high-level Microsoft guidance on how to recover from a domain compromise at that level. So the original talk, we went into the recovery portion of this. For this one, we're just going to be detection and triage. Kind of the difference between this talk and the original talk, we do go a little bit further into detail into some of our latest offensive tradecraft from our adversary simulation team, focusing on ADCS abuse, Active Directory certificate service abuse, and configuration manager abuse, okay? All right, so let's talk about the attack path that kind of led to this research, right? So as defenders, we typically, and pen testers and red teamers a lot of times, we typically get this bias that every attack path has to start from a low privilege user, a salesperson, an HR person, someone who's forward facing in the company, right? Someone who's often communicating with external entities in the outside of the environment. And then we kind of have this bias that, you know, the adversary is going to locally privilege escalate, and they're going to identify some way to propagate, and they're going to eventually figure out some elevated credential that they can harvest. And then if they can even make it that far undetected, then they're going to attempt some sort of domain compromise-like technique. In real life, it's a lot quicker. It's a lot less steps. And that's kind of the scary part when I talk to clients and I find out they don't have detections for a lot of the techniques that I'm going to be talking about, okay? All right, so the way the compromise assessment worked at an extremely high level, the adversary was able to exploit CVE 2019-0604 against a company's forward-facing SharePoint server. I don't remember if the company knew this SharePoint server was forward-facing, but either way, it was. And that particular CVE allowed the adversary to get remote code execution by uploading ASPX files and then running those post commands. It eventually gave them system-level access to the SharePoint server by abusing the server farm service account on that host. Okay. Now, they got initial access and privilege escalation all in one go, all in the same shot, right? So now that point, they are at the level of system. They then simply looked for any active RDP connections to those SharePoint servers, and sure enough, there was 2 domain admins who were actively or interactively logging in via RDP. And so the SharePoint server did have Carbon Black app control turned on, which is really good for detecting things that are not Microsoft signed. Unfortunately for the client, they had sysinternals spread all over the environment, and sysinternals is Microsoft signed. The adversary realized this. They used proc dump. They stole a copy of the LSAS process dump, brought it back to their attacker machine, ran Mimikatz against it, and harvested the credentials of the domain admins that would remotely interactively log on to this host. So now within 2 steps, they're DA, right? From there, the adversary from the SharePoint server, again, using Microsoft signed binaries to use PSExec in the domain admin's credentials, and laterally moved to the domain controller. Okay, so that's super bad. Okay. And then for the last step, they created a scheduled task on the domain controller that would continually use NTDS util to dump the ntds.diff file. If you're not familiar with what that is, that's the database file that contains all your Active Directory users and computers and their secrets. Okay. So they dumped that file, and then with like invoke Ninja Copy and PowerCat, they shot it off to their external controlled host. Okay. So in 4 easy steps, we have complete domain compromise. Okay. This went on for a very, very long time. By the time that they had seen it, they were simply doing a demo of a new defensive EDR in their environment, and the defensive EDR caught the NTDS.dit dumping, and that's what led to the investigation of this compromise. Okay, so the reason I show you that is because, like I said, we tend to get this bias that a lot of attack paths have to have 16 different steps, and there's no way the adversary could do all of this without us seeing. In reality, sometimes it's as simple as 4 easy steps. Okay. All right, so defining kind of like domain persistence. There's not a technique ID in MITRE ATT&CK that contains domain persistence. I mean, there sort of is, but it's not really what we're talking about here. How we classify domain persistence is where an adversary can gain elevated control to your environment and make some sort of modification, make some sort of action in your environment that will persist, all right? In this case, the domain persistence techniques that the adversary that we were talking about used, they did credential dumping, right, on the domain controller, and they also did ntds.dit theft on the domain controller. So using ntds.util to steal a copy of the Active Directory users and computers database. So at this point, this client not only is completely compromised in this case, they are also in a situation where they could be susceptible to a reoccurring compromise, even if they were to go and mitigate a lot of this stuff. Okay. So the techniques that we're going to talk about is credential theft on the domain controller via LSAS memory, NTDS access, DC sync, golden ticket, diamond ticket, Active Directory certificate service abuse, SCCM recon, cred1, takeover1, and exec1. It's a lot. This is going to be a fire hose of information. I'm going to give you the data models or in the event IDs that are relevant to these attack techniques taking place, but I'm also going to give you kind of the operational context where I say, hey, this is an event ID that will fire when this techniques exist. However, in real life as a defender, you're going to have a hard time using it without unrealistic amounts of baselining, okay? So I'm going to give you both the relevant guidance and the operational guidance for this. And Nico's going to take it away, starting us off with credential theft on the domain controller.
Yeah, and again, just to Josh's larger, greater point, usually when you see any one of the techniques you see here on this list, that's sign of a larger, more systematic attack, right? If someone's able to get a golden ticket, which we talk about, or they're able to create a diamond ticket, that usually means that there was other activity in the environment that you missed or were unaware of. All right, so does this work?
It is.
Oh, perfect. Okay, cool. So first we're going to talk about credential theft on the domain controller with LSAS memory. You see, I'm not going to go through, some of these slides are a little beefy. The reason for that is we're going to put this on GitHub after, and you can use it as a resource. In a version of this talk, like Josh said, where we talked about recovery and triage, those are available on GitHub as well with kind of like step-by-step instructions.
We kind of designed this to be kind of a take-home thing, where it's like, at some point you're tasked with writing a detection for DC sync. Just pull up these slides, download them from GitHub, take a look at the data model in there, and now you're good to go at least with the data model, and you can start baselining from there.
Yep. All right, so real quick, audience interaction, which I know we all love. What are some methods we have for dumping LSAS on a client? It's not a trick question, just anything. Yes?
Dump?
Sure. Yes.
You dump, right dump? Yep.
Who else?
Task Manager, yeah, that's a good one, yeah.
Yep, so that was the one I was going to touch on, right? Just right-click on Task Manager, or right-click on the LSAS process inside Task Manager, you can create a dump file. Anyone else? Okay, no worries, we're going to walk through some of this. So the big differences in some of these things in opening a handle to the LSAS process is some methods are going to have different access rights, right? So for example, if you use Mimikatz out of the box, a lot of the Mimikatz flags, people have created detections to catch on specifically. For us, when we do our red teams or when we do our penetration stuff, everything's automated. So you're going to see different IOCs, different hashes. Nothing's going to be the same, right? The access mask rights aren't going to be the same thing. So you can't necessarily count on an adversary just using the default Mimikatz settings, right? So for example, you can change that Mimikatz code to avoid that 1410 or 1010 flag, which might set off a detection. Some methods are going to avoid open process of LSAS.exe, right? Instead, they're going to look for leaked handles, create child processes of LSAS, or create a snapshot. However, each of the techniques you'll see here are usually going to utilize the read process memory API calls, right? So that's going to be a more robust way to try to detect this behavior. And of course, on clients, Microsoft has CredGuard, which you can use to isolate the LSAS.exe process. And we're going to talk about why that matters here, right? So you might ask, okay, what's different with credential theft via LSAS on the domain controller vice a normal client? Well, if you can imagine, right, using CredGuard on a domain controller and isolating that lsas.exe process might cause issues inside your domain, right? And Microsoft's own documentation, which again, we link in this project when we share it, Microsoft itself recommends against enabling CredGuard on the domain controller, because again, isolating that LSAS process is going to cause issues throughout your domain. What else is different about a domain controller versus a client? Well, you're going to have accessibility to tier 0 accounts, right? The domain controller, by necessity, is going to have those interactive logged on, it's going to have those cached credentials from people who are authorized to work on the domain controller, which are usually going to be accounts that an adversary would find interesting for further exfiltration, right? All right, is anyone familiar with this detection model?
Or data model.
Yeah, this data model here. No one. Okay, perfect. So we'll do a brief overview. So this is how we kind of break down our research when we're thinking about detections, right? So let's say we have credential theft on the DC, which is something we care about. There are a few different modules that we can look at when we're talking about detections. We have process creation, a process requesting handle, process access, and process memory read. How do we do this? Blog posts, Twitter, whatever you have to do to kind of piece together how exactly the technology you're examining works. And then we have what we call here entity relationship diagrams, right? So we have, when we're talking about process creation, breaking that down, right, that's a little vague. How do we do that in a detection? Process creating a process. And for that, we can look at Sysmon event ID 1, Windows Security Event 4688, right? So a process requesting handle, we have a process request handle to a process. Let's see if I can aim it there. Okay, and we have the Windows security events associated with that event, right? So you're gonna see this a few times as we go through these techniques. Just wanted to give a brief overview since it didn't seem like people had seen this kind of model before.
When you look at Windows security events, when you look at just telemetry in general for detection engineering purposes, I want you to always think of kind of like this entity-action-entity relationship, because that's how events are written. There's always a source entity, there's some relationship, some action that occurs, and then there's a target entity. And that's essentially how we break apart events and how we do these data models.
Yep, and again, don't really have time to break down each of those specific Windows security events. They will be available to you after, but for example, process creating a process, right? That Sysmon 1 event is gonna log the process creating a process. Same with that Windows security event, and that's gonna be how you break that out. Okay, so NTDS access, Josh already kind of briefly talked about ntds.dit, how that's available as kind of an attack vector for adversaries. So because ntds.dit is usually can't be accessed.
It's deadlocked.
Yeah, it's deadlocked by ADUC, right? Active Directory Users and Computers. And that's always running, right? If you have any sort of enterprise environment, that's just something that's always running on the domain controller, which means that ntds.dit is always hard locked. So how does an adversary access it? They can use something like the volume shadow service to create a copy of that ntds.dit file, upload or exfiltrate whatever they need to do to get that ntds.dit file to where they want to work on it locally. And that copy will let you access the same amount of data. All right, so who here is familiar with SACLs? SACLs, Defender's best friend. Okay, few hands. So you can, manipulating that ntds.dit file is going to give you a few forms of telemetry. However, it's not default out of the box. You have to go in and set the SACL on the ntds.dit file itself so that if you do get people trying to access that ntds.dit file, you create telemetry. Again,
when that volume shadow copy service runs, it will have to access whatever portion of the drive that you were running it from, and then that will also access the ntds.dit. What's your question? Okay.
Not default, you have to go and turn it on yourself, right? Which is going to be the case with a lot of the SACLs that we talk about here. And SACLs, again, are just ways in which we generate telemetry and event IDs. All right, so ntds.dit access, right? We have a process requesting a handle to ntds.dit. We have a service starting, the volume shadow service, and we have shadow copy creation. And each one of those is going to have entity, action, entity relationships with security, Windows security or Sysmon event IDs that we as defenders can look at and incorporate into our broader holistic detections. All right, DC Sync, right? Tried and true. A lot of people here are familiar with it. It's been around for a very long time. So directory replication service, that auditing, again, not enabled by default. It's something you have to turn on yourself. I won't dive into this super deep because, again, there's a ton of detections online, whether it's published by Splunk, Lantern, or Palo Alto Unit 42, their research arm, whatever the case is, tons of blog posts, event IDs, detections available for that DC sync. And again, it rose in popularity due to kind of the ethical issues with red teams performing NTDS. DC sync also rose in popularity for red teams, right, because of kind of the ethical issues you have with NTDS.dit.
I can talk about that.
Yeah.
So when you as a pen tester or you as a red teamer steal a copy of the NTDS.dit, there's a portion of Active Directory users and computers called the domain DPAPI backup key. As per Microsoft guidance and recommendations, this cannot be changed, okay? So when I talked about how badly that client was compromised, and I said they're kind of susceptible to reoccurring compromise, it's because of that domain DPAPI backup key. That key is how your entire enterprise domain encrypts everything for every user across Windows. Okay, and it cannot be changed. Yep. We've done some side research. It can be changed, but you have a 50-50 chance of actually like encrypting your entire domain on accident. So no one's actually going to change it. All right, no one's actually going to attempt it. But yes, that's the idea. If someone steals the NTDS.dit, like ideally as a red teamer, you shouldn't be doing it. You shouldn't be stealing it because ethically, the client has to accept the risk that if you as a red teamer get compromised, their NTDS.dit and backup key is also compromised. So that's why DC Sync is more popular. Typically, as our adversary simulation team, we'll just go after a particular domain admin or a particular user and DC Sync that user, proving we have the ability to DC Sync all users.
Yep, absolutely. And again, breaking down the data into actual security events that we can use in our detections. Process connection, we have a process connected to DC via the DRSU API, and that gets NC changes request, which is going to be a process connecting to an IP address, generating these events, so on and so forth for the remainder of that diagram. All right, so golden tickets. Where we talk about Kerberos, show of hands if you're familiar with like KDC, TGT, TGS.
Okay. Good amount.
All right, good amount. Okay, cool. So I'm not going to necessarily break down how that specifically works, because again, we want to get to some of the interesting SCCM stuff. Where's the mouse? Is it this one? Oh, there we go. Perfect. Nope. Figuring it out on the fly. There we go. All right, so just a brief overview, right? That KRB TGT account in the Microsoft Active Directory, it's going to be a service account that acts as a key distribution center, or KDC, which is central to how the Kerberos authentication protocol works, right? If you can imagine, who here has like a shared drive at work or college, high school, whatever? Yeah, right? How annoying would it be if every time you accessed a shared resource, you had to put in a password, for example, right? Kerberos handles all that authentication to resources on the back end. So the goal being you as a user authenticate once, at least that you can see, and then Kerberos handles a lot of the other authentication for shared resources on the back end. So typical operational flow for a golden ticket, right? And this is, you can use tools like Mimikatz or Rubius to create out-of-the-box golden tickets. You're just forging that golden ticket request once you get the FQDN of the domain, the SID of the domain, the account you're impersonating, and that KRB TGT password hash, right? Which you can get with the dump file we talked about earlier, or that NTDS.dit. It'll be located in there. So they use a tool, an adversary will use a tool to forge that ticket from scratch, and then access the resources that would be available to someone that had a legitimately issued ticket. Now, we as defenders, right? We're all defenders here. So we as defenders, some of the things we can look at, right? Mimikatz timestamps. So default, those tickets are going to have 10-year lifespans, et cetera, right? We talked about access mask flags, right? Those tools are going to have default behaviors. And tripping on those, you'll catch adversaries that don't change things or script kiddies that just use things out of the box. Again, you won't catch those more advanced adversaries, but something we can look at. All right, so what are some data sources we can look at when it comes to golden tickets? So we have event ID 4768, TGT requested, right? That's you doing that initial login, say, hey, I'm me, I'm user Nico, I want a ticket to be able to access the rest of these resources. I'm gonna authenticate, and now I'm good to go. And I have a ticket that can request services from then on. And then you have event ID 4769, which is like, hey, I have this TGT, I would like permission to access the shared resource. And again, these event IDs, 4768 and 4769, are not default. You have to go in and actually set up the telemetry yourself. Why it's not default, right? You can imagine there's a lot of noise. So if you're ingesting that, if you're not able to properly handle it, parse it, filter it at the shipper level, you could fill up whatever your kind of memory quotas are for telemetry very quickly. And we also have Klist, which Klist is part of the Rubius tool, and also you can just run it if you have the Active Directory module loaded in PowerShell, and it'll just show all the active tickets issued for a given user. Now, what's interesting is the white paper on Kerberos was written back in the 1990s, right? So someone came up with the idea of Kerberos as an authentication protocol before it was incorporated by Microsoft, Ubuntu, Mac, any kind of big OS shop. And in that white paper, they came up with a way to track tickets as they were issued, right? And think how wonderful that would be as a defender. You're unsure if a ticket is given to a legitimate user. Cool, well, I can look at ticket 1114. This user isn't in our company. Bam, we alert on that. Microsoft, when they implemented it, did not incorporate that ticket counting process, right? There's no centralized way to look at every single ticket given out within your domain. And that's why a lot of this is difficult, right? We as defenders are kind of trying to piecemeal these disparate pieces into like a picture that makes sense to us. So with golden tickets, because the ticket is being forged, we can look for those 4769 events, right? The service is requested, but that user won't necessarily have a matching 4768. Why? Because they didn't request that TGT to begin with, right? They're just requesting services after the fact. All right, show of hands who's familiar with BPMN notation.
Oh, cool. Nice.
Yeah, there we go. Someone got an MBA. So BPMN, right, is how companies like Microsoft kind of annotate out their operational flow. Like as mentioned earlier, I finished my master's earlier this year, and I thought, okay, I think this can also be applied to like how into a discrete, kind of concrete, repeatable way of lining up how adversaries carry out attacks, right? So we have three lanes here. We have the adversary, the domain controller, and the KDC. And the purpose of this diagram is to just show you like how an adversary goes through the process of getting that golden ticket, what's happening in the KDC, and what's happening at the domain controller. Again, this will be available to you all in the GitHub we post out. You can go through this. I'm still workshopping this, so if there's stuff in here that doesn't make sense with how it's annotated, let me know, because we're kind of like taking a business idea and shoehorning it into cybersecurity. All right, diamond tickets. So instead of creating their own TGT, like with golden tickets, adversaries can instead modify a legitimately issued TGT that was given out by the KDC. So you can imagine how that's an issue, right? What an adversary will do is they'll find on the wire with Wireshark or whatever tool they're using, get a legitimately issued ticket by that KDC and modify the pack. And the pack is the component of the ticket that's going to have the rights access, the username, all the kind of like data associated with the specific user account. So you can decrypt the pack if the tickets don't have strong encryption, or again, you have that KRB TGT hash. And remake the pack to come up with a new user with a different lifespan, with different resource access, perhaps, right? So you're decrypting it, changing that. Think of it as like the signature on a check, right? You're changing the signature, and you're now cashing in the check as a different user. So what are some things we can look at here, right? So with the golden ticket, we had maybe service requests that weren't necessarily associated with the creation of the ticket in the first place. Something that adversaries do with diamond tickets sometimes is request an entirely new ticket, change the pack, right? So that ticket isn't going to have any TGS requests associated with it. So we as defenders can try to isolate it to say, this user got a ticket, and then they didn't have any TGS requests after the fact, right? Because again, we won't have anything associated with that ticket since the pack was changed. Hard to do at scale, as you can imagine. But again, we're trying to just piece together these different components to come up with a larger, more holistic detection. And on the right side of these slides, which again, you'll have access to, we have some different detection strategies that we have, right? And this, honestly, the easiest way to, not the easiest way to do it, but the way we see this carried out successfully at the enterprise level is going to be baselining, and again, just trying to break out specific tickets that trip some of the detections that we have and examining them at a closer level. And here we have that BPMN diagram for diamond tickets with the adversary, domain controller, and KDC. Again, the difference being you're just modifying that pack in order to access the services that you require. And with that, I'll hand it back to Josh, who's going to go over ADCS and SCCM.
I'm gonna do my best. All right, y'all. Okay, so who here is familiar with the escalation paths since the certified pre-owned white paper from Will Schroeder and Lee Christensen came out? All right, it was a great white paper. Not only did it have good offensive recommendations, it had really good defensive recommendations too. And at SpectreOps, not to sound too shilly, transparency is really one of our core pillars, and we believe in benefiting both the offensive community as well as the defensive community. We go hand in hand with everything. If you read any of our blogs, I'll always have some sort of defensive recommendation in there. All right, so since Certified Pre-Owned came out, there was a handful of escalation attack paths that existed. Since that time, since that paper has come out, we're now at ESC 15. All right, some of these are
Like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I think 2 weeks ago.
I don't even
ESC
know what's
15.
in it, to be honest, because they come out so quickly.
They come out quickly. We have a research team dedicated to finding these escalation paths, and then it immediately gets jammed into our Bloodhound product. And so some of these are happening so quickly. We're like, I need a workshop to catch up. This is a lot. Okay, for a lot of the escalation attack paths, a lot of them focused on ADCS will at some point need to modify the actual certificate template itself. And that is where we're going to centralize our detective telemetry, okay? Here's an example of using Bloodhound to identify the authenticated user group is able to have generic all access over these two certificate templates. Why is that bad? Well, because a authenticated user, which is everybody in the domain, right? Everybody in the domain basically has the ability to go and modify these certificate templates. I think for this particular situation, those templates were not published, but if they were, that would be very, very bad, okay? All right, so from a data model perspective, like I said, we're gonna try to centralize our telemetry around the fact that regardless of the escalation, at least for most of them, paths that they take, at some point they will have to actually access the certificate template itself, okay? So we have machine cert enrollment for user request a particular cert. We have an event ID for that, 4886. We have a machine cert was issued, and that's where the certificate authority actually issues the certificate. There's a particular event ID for that. We have machine cert modified. There's a security 4899 and 4900. However, I want to point out for that one to happen, the certificate template not only has to be modified, it has to be enrolled as well for both of those events to generate. So to kind of provide an additional layer of detection, we can set a SACL on our certificate templates to know when they were accessed and modified, which will generate an event ID 4663, okay? All of this is in that certified pre-owned white paper. So if you are a detection engineer and you are responsible for coming up with ADCS detections, highly recommend you take a look at that paper from Lee and Will. Okay, so let's talk about SCCM, all right? Why has there been a big push into offensive research for SCCM? I mean, it's been around since 1995, right? Honestly, one of the big pushers for this offensive research is that we basically use Microsoft's implementation of software management as a C2 platform. I did a red team not too long ago where we had already gained site takeover. We were in complete control from a SCCM perspective over the entire corp domain and all its subsidiaries. And that we were at the point at the end of the red team where the defenders hadn't caught us yet, and we're like, let's make a little bit of noise so that we can get a little bit louder and get the defenders caught on our trail on purpose, right? And so I was doing this red team. At this point, I hadn't really messed around with SCCM too much. Garrett Foster, who's kind of one of our lead red teamers, who has done a lot of the SCCM research recently, he was the one who got site takeover in about 5 hours. So I was trying to do some really poor tradecraft lateral movements techniques just to kind of see if the defenders would catch it. And he messages me and he's like, oh, hey, I saw you trying to laterally move over there. Do you want me just to pass you a beacon? And with SCCM, right, he executed my beacon. He basically told the SCCM client machine to call the remote share drive, pull down the beacon that he had staged there and execute it. And so we're using SCCM as a C2 framework, basically.
Is anyone familiar with Misconfiguration Manager or Sharp SCCM, some of these tools? Right. Perfect.
Okay. So we'll do kind of a quick overview of SCCM really quick. I always have a hard time saying this word. I'm sorry. It's a hierarchical. There you go.
Sounds right. We're not English majors.
Right. So typically you have a CAS server or a central administration site server, which will communicate with the primary site servers or secondary site servers. And those trickle down to the actual, we'll call them configuration manager clients. So these are the endpoints. These are your folks' laptops, your folks' servers, your machines that you're pushing these applications to, or controlling the software on them, right? Okay, so Dwayne, Chris Thompson, Garrett Foster, they came up with this research project called Misconfiguration Manager. And it's gained a lot of interest lately. They're still adding stuff all the time. I wrote some of the detections for it, and I'm still writing detections for it. I got one like stashed in GitHub right now. And we just added another reconnaissance technique to it, I think last week.
Yep.
And so we're going to talk about what each one of these different sections are. But the goal of this was to kind of manage a taxonomy of the different methods of abusing Configuration Manager for offensive purposes, as well as providing a lot of preventative controls for defenders and detective controls for defenders. Okay. All right, so starting off with reconnaissance, we're still doing good. Yeah. Yep. So starting off with reconnaissance, typically, these are used for methods of identifying the SCCM systems. So primary site servers, secondary site servers, distribution servers, SMS providers. Our goal is essentially to enumerate the different SCCM infrastructure, because a lot of the attack techniques that we want to execute, they have to have the actual site server FQDN. You can't just say like, yeah, let me just execute this and SCCM will pick it up. That's not really how it works. You have to be very specific on how you execute these commands. So reconnaissance is a kind of a must-have for a lot of these techniques. Okay?
And the reason why like Recon's so important, like Josh said, right? Recon 6 was pushed out last week. We used it in a recent client engagement, very recent if it was last week, right? And a lot of the reconnaissance is being done with LDAP queries that any authenticated user in the domain can carry out. So you don't even have to be domain admin, anything like that. Just carry out some of the basic LDAP queries used in these recon techniques.
Yeah, I should just pointed that out. So and then Misconfiguration Manager project in that GitHub, we have like Recon 1 through 6. And the variants in a lot of these are essentially the method of execution or the communication mechanism really. And so you can identify SCCM infrastructure by doing LDAP queries. You can make SMB requests. You can do HTTP commands. You can even use name pipes to identify the SCCM infrastructure. Okay. All right. Then we have the list of CRED techniques as well. So the goal of CRED is to identify SCCM specific credentials, and that can be abused in a way where essentially we can utilize the same credential for PXE boot to be able to steal the credential out of the PXE boot variable files and then leverage that against the domain, right? Typically, it's installing a whole like patchwork of operating system management patches on the operating system itself via SCCM and these PXE boot credentials, right? So if we can leverage that against it, we typically will be able to identify a privileged credential in that. Then we get to execution. So execution is all about the different methods that we can deploy an application through SCCM. We can do everything from using PowerShell and WMI providers, such as the SMS Prov WMI providers, or we could utilize even CM Pivot if we can gain access to the necessary SCCM infrastructure. All right, and then the overall goal is what we would consider site takeover. So whether it be a primary site, a secondary site, but we want to take over that section of the hierarchy in SCCM or the complete hierarchy of SCCM in that particular enterprise environment. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the ideas here. So there's a whole bunch of these different techniques in the Misconfiguration Manager project. We're not going to cover all of them. So I'm covering pretty much the first one, so like CRED 1, exec 1, takeover 1 from that project. And then for recon, I did make a data model for complete recon 1 through 6, okay?
And the data models for these, again, when you look at them on your own, because they don't necessarily involve discrete steps like some of the techniques we talked about earlier, they are a work in progress, right? I think we're still figuring out a taxonomy for how we break these down for defenders for specific detection. So
yeah, I'm going to show you data models that aren't even on GitHub yet for this stuff. Okay, so for CRED 1, the CRED 1 technique is gained at identifying servers that would contain PXE boot variable settings, which can often contain the PXE boot credentials themselves that we can harvest. typical operational flow, we're going to identify and connect to a distribution point via SMB. We're going to enumerate the remote install share. It's called RIM inst, all right? Remote install share, and then that's typically utilized for like Windows Deployment Services or WDS. We're going to enumerate within that share the SMS temp directory, which contains variable files, .var files that would contain those credentials in there. And we're essentially just going to spider that whole directory and pull back any .var file. And then usually attackers have offensive tooling that will like automagically parse a lot of those files to find creds based on like known paths to do that. All right. So for the data model, we have event ID 3 for identifying an SMB connection. Now that's not super realistic, right? That's like a network connection was created over port 445, happens natively all the time. It's not a really good source of telemetry. What is a good source of telemetry though, is that we can use event ID 5145, the detailed file share event. Alternatively, we could set a specific SACL on that RIM inst share. But the detailed file share event will show any sort of connection from an endpoint and a user that made that endpoint connection request to that RIM inst or remote install share. Additionally, we can look for the access of SMS temp. Again, event ID 5145, the detailed file share log, won't only show us going after the file share, it'll actually show the SMS temp directory referenced in that file share as well. And again, we can set a SACL on that directory and kind of like try to baseline that activity. And then finally, we can set SACLs on those .var files for these distribution point servers. Okay, so this is this is SCCM Recon kind of 1 through 6. I just didn't put the numbers up there, okay? But we can do it through we can do recon through SMB, LDAP queries, name pipes, or HTTP to remotely identify central administration servers, primary servers, or site servers, secondary site servers, distribution points, management points, things like that. Additionally, what a lot of offensive tooling will do is it will connect to the domain controller and it will query this section of the domain controller, this container called system management. That system management container contains all your SCCM, basically like your machine account settings in there. It can be enumerated from just authenticated domain users, and we can pull back that information to identify what the site servers and the secondary site servers and things like that are. So that's for remote reconnaissance. We can also do local reconnaissance. If an adversary has compromised a SCCM client, we can take a look at the cwindows CCM logs smsts.log file. That will contain information about distribution points, SMS providers, site servers, things like that. Additionally, there's more information that can be found within CCM cache and CCM setup as well. Okay, so we have remote and local enumeration that will tell us about SCCM infrastructure in this environment.
And as a show of hands, people familiar with beacon object files, BOFs used in C2? Okay, cool. So Trusted Sec has an SA BOF they put out, and this reconnaissance could be as simple as running the LDAP query BOF and looking for those, I always mess up the acronym, MSSM sites, right?
Yeah, MSSS.
Yeah. There's S's in there. So it's literally just LDAP query site server, and you get that information back as an authenticated user.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if you change the method of execution, whether you use PowerShell, whether you use Sharp SCCM, or whether you use SCCM Hunter, if you do the beacon object file LDAP query from the situational awareness box from Trusted Sec, regardless, the behavior is still going to be the same. You're still going to be generating LDAP queries in the environment. We can catch that via event ID 1644. It's that last one down there at the bottom. 1644 is a domain controller LDAP diagnostic log, okay? It is designed to catch inefficient LDAP querying in your environment, okay? It is not designed for operational security tooling as well, or is not designed for operational security. So with that in mind, this log does have some cons to using, right? One is it's typically 100 megabyte limit on that log file. So if you're going to centralize it, you got to centralize it quick. Also, it's kind of not very clear on what it considers inefficient LDAP queries. But for my testing, executing a lot of SpectreOps' SCCM offensive tooling for the reconnaissance portion of this, it'll typically always catch those LDAP queries that are being ran in the environment. So But it does work. You can be centralized, and you can detect it. I have proposed it to a couple of production clients, and they're like, "Nah, it's too verbose. I don't want to turn that on." Okay, for local recon, right, we can set a SACL on those directories. Now, I have just one listed in here, but ideally, you could set it on the CCM directory. You could set it on CCM logs, smsts.log file. You could set it on CCM cache. You can set the SACL on whatever you want. If you're not familiar with SACLs, it's a way defenders can set custom auditing on any object in Windows. And remember, for Windows, everything is an object, right? Okay, so now let's get into execution. So like I said, the goal of execution is basically to force the SCCM client or the endpoint that's using or being controlled by SCCM to execute our beacon or execute our file or execute whatever us as offensive operators can control, okay? Typically, the way an application deployment works in SCCM is, make sure y'all can hear me, sorry, is first a collection has to be created. A collection can be users, it can be devices, computers. Then a application and scope have to be created. Then a deployment where it kind of puts all those together with a scope will be created. And then that deployment will be initiated, okay? Luckily for us, there is this thing called the SCCM or Configuration Manager status message queue that can be centralized, and we can leverage that to effectively write detections for anomalous creation of collections, applications, and deployment, okay? And so again, all of these steps have to be completed in order for us to successfully execute or successfully pass an application executable to the SCCM client, right? Kind of the thing to remember here is that when we're talking for Configuration Manager, there's a couple different ways that I can reference the application that I'm creating in this case. I can call a binary that's actually on the SCCM client already. So like if target1 has calc.exe on there, I can make the application target1's calc process or calc binary. I can also reference a UNC path for like a share drive. So if beacon.exe is on file share 1, I don't actually have to have access to target 1. I just have to make sure target 1 has access to file share 1. And through SCCM, I can create an application deployment that says, hey, your application is hosted over here in file share 1. I want you to go, I want you to call it down, and I want you to execute it. And now I have a beacon on target 1, okay? And then we can also just simply upload a binary. If I gained enough control and I was running this through like the Configuration Manager console, I could actually just upload my binary to the actual SCCM infrastructure itself, and the SCCM client agent will go and pull that down and execute it. So there's a couple different ways that we can conduct execution. Regardless, they still have to go through these steps of creating a collection. That's the list of devices or users that we're targeting in this case. We still have to create an application. That's the application UNC path that we're referencing. We have to create a deployment which combines the collection scope and the application that we're referencing. And then we have to initiate that deployment. There is status message queue logs for each one of these. So we have 30015 for collection created, 30152 for application created, 30226 for a deployment was created, and then 40800 for a deployment initiated. Okay. All right, and then getting into takeover 1. I think we just got enough time. All right, so takeover 1 talks about how we can do what's called NTLM relay. Show of hands, who here has heard of NTLM relay in the last couple of years? Oh, nice, awesome. Okay, so the way NTLM relay works, you hear folks talk about how NTLM relay is kind of like this really cool, scary attack technique that's come out recently, or a couple years ago recently. But what you don't actually hear is like how it really works under the hood a lot of times. So the way relay actually works is you have a relay point. So why this attack technique is important is because by default, the SCCM site server, so either a primary site server or secondary site server, will have full administrative control over the MS-SQL database server that SCCM site server is using, okay? If I am just an authenticated user, I don't even think the client that I'm on or I've compromised. Oh no, what happened?
Did the wire come on?
Okay, we're good.
There we go.
Don't touch it. I don't even think the client that I've compromised has to actually be a SCCM client. It can just simply be attached to the domain, like connected to the domain, okay? And I'm an authenticated user. I can use SMB to coerce authentication from the SCCM site server that I'm targeting, and I can act as the relay point and toss it onto the MS SQL database server, which now gives me, by default, full administrative control over that SQL database server. And now that I have full control over the SQL database server, I can do things like run SQL commands and essentially like do what's considered site takeover, okay? All right, now I didn't do a data model for this one because detecting it is kind of funky. There's a couple of different detective controls that we can put in place. All of these will require a bunch of baselining, and this last one down here, I'm gonna tell you right now, is very, very unrealistic, but it is telemetry that's generated. So for the first one, we have a successful logon event of 4624. Okay, it's going to be a logon type 3 for NTLM relay, and the authentication package is going to be NTLM SSP, obviously, right? The detection that we have in place is going to be, you're going to compare the subject account name. It's going to be a machine account. It should be filtered by your list of primary and secondary site servers. Okay, so it's going to be the primary and secondary site servers and machine accounts are successfully logging into a host name or a host machine name where the login event is originating from, then it doesn't match, right? So if you're seeing, let's say if we see SCCM site server $ machine account logs in successfully to SQL server, right? That would be an indication of NTLM relay. Now, it does require a lot of baselining. And ideally, the host name that you're filtering on as well, right? So that target is going to be really your SQL database servers. There is nothing really stopping an adversary from coercing and relaying authentication and targeting like server 2 or literally anything like file server. But in order to kind of like have a actual detection that we can use, we want to kind of follow along the lines of the expected attack path, which is someone is coercing authentication from the SCCM site server and relaying it to the SQL database server that it controls, okay? All right, additionally, one of the things that adversaries will have to do in order to get this to work is they typically have to stop the landman server service, server 2 and server net services. The reason that they do this is because by default, the Windows kernel will bind to port 445. Stopping this service unbinds that 445 to the kernel. And so these are usually typically one of the steps that they'll have to do in order to successfully NTLM relay. And then this last one I have down here is an event ID 18 from Sysmon, where a connection to the LSA RPC name pipe will be generated. However, everything in its mother uses the LSA RPC name pipe. So identifying NTLM relay with that is drastically unrealistic, even if you spent like days baselining, okay? I don't know, maybe you guys have some super secret swirl sauce, and if you do, that's great. But for the most of us that are just using Sysmon and Windows security events, using LSA RPC is not generally a realistic detection in this case. And so that takes us to the end of our presentation. What I wanted you to take away from this is that many organizations do not have custom detective controls around the techniques that we talked about. And fair enough, a lot of defenders usually think that an adversary would never make it that far without at least having one detection fire, but we've seen it. It does happen, unfortunately. And then another piece, we typically talk about recovery, but we don't really have the time in this talk. When you're designing your recovery procedures and plans, make sure you consider these type of techniques in your environment. Make sure you consider the, oh no, burn down the forest and start all over again type of scenarios, because they can happen. And unfortunately for the client that generated this whole content, they did not think that through. And so we had to help them generate these recovery procedures on the fly, okay?
And kind of, again, what's important with that is that domain backup DPAPI key, right? Like Josh mentioned earlier, our colleague Alex Su did some research. And for, let's say, like, who here has like an enterprise organizational environment where you can afford to just take it offline and completely rebuild it, right?
You saw Garrett's name on?
Yeah, we saw some laughter, right? Again, that's just so unrealistic. And that's why a lot of the triage and recovery steps that we have on GitHub kind of walk you through like what you can do to the best of your ability within your domain. Because we realize it's unrealistic to just expect someone to build up an entire domain.
If you are a security engineer in here and you're like, this talk sucked, I can't prevent any of this, absolutely untrue, okay? The Misconfiguration Manager project has more preventions than it does detections. Go in there, take a look at that. I taught our identity-driven offensive tradecraft course last week, And one of the students said, hey, I went through your NTLM relay recommendations for preventing NTLM relay and coercion. And they said it took us about a year, but we were able to successfully implement all the things. And we tested it, and sure enough, it stops NTLM coercion and relay. So it can be prevented. Almost all of these can be prevented in some form of capacity, or at least additional preventions can make it significantly harder. We just talked about the detective section for this, okay? All right, we're here if we have any questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, it'll be on there.
Yeah, and we'll work with the organizers to get the GitHub that will contain the resources we talked about and the resources we use as references and get that to all of you.